Welcome, Helen O'Hara. I'm very excited to talk to you today. Writer on film, film critic at Empire and the Daily Telegraph and various other publications, also contributor to the Empire podcast and author of the fantastic new book, Women versus Hollywood. So it's really great to chat to you today.
And thank you
for taking the time. This we've been running this series over the last couple of months, and obviously the students haven't had the usual education experience that they might have, but it's been great to they've got to hear from people doing all sorts of really interesting jobs within the media industry. So it's great to talk to someone who writes about film for a living, and hear about your own career and work practices. I wanted actually, just before we kicked off, I wanted to share, you mentioned in this month's Empire, you were talking about how you were doing a piece on the best films in 1984.
Oh yeah.
And you mentioned you were going to include Splash, and then you realized the amount of female nudity in the film when you watched it. I had a very similar experience. We watched that film with our kids recently.
Yeah, well, it's right there on Disney Plus, right? So you're family entertainment, brilliant.
But there's 15 minutes in the middle, which is basically just Tom Hanks and Daryl Hannah having sex, which I had completely gone over my head when I watched it in 1984.
Yeah. Rose-tinted glasses, I think, a little bit for that one, as it turns out.
Yeah, I know. So thankfully, I think it went over their heads too. So I mean, you write on film for famous publications. I mean, maybe you might just take us back a little bit to how you started. I know you originally were working as a barrister.
Yeah, so I trained and qualified as a barrister and immediately gave up. So I'd been quite sensible when I was young. I used to be sensible, and I was thinking, look, I'll be a lawyer. You get a nice living, have a nice house, all that kind of stuff, and then I really hated all the practical side of law. I quite like the philosophical airy-fairy kind of, international law and human rights law and stuff like that. But like the practical stuff that you actually make a living out of, hated it with a passion. But I kept giving it a go because I kept thinking, well, I've come this far. I've done my degree. I may as well do bar school. I've done bar school. I may as well do pupillage. And then at pupillage, I was like, right, if I get taken on at the chambers that I'm at, because it's a weird system in England. If I get taken on at this particular place, I'll give it a couple of years, I'll save up, and then I'll jump. And thankfully I didn't get taken on, because I think it would have been really hard to get used to that, to jump after getting used to that money.
Sure.
And as it was, there were like 3 of us. They only had space for 1. They took the much posher girl, which I was genuinely thrilled about. and I jumped. So I was still trying to be vaguely sensible. So I was applying for like government legal service, law reporting, thinking that maybe one day I'd be able to somehow move sideways, which I don't think ever would have happened.
From law reporting to film, right?
Yeah, I was thinking like it's a bit of a leap, but maybe if you get your foot in the door, then you can, I don't know. I'm not saying I had thought it through, basically. And then I kind of took a job for a few months working for a charity, just because it was there and they needed someone temporary. And while I was there, an internship came up at Empire Online, and I applied for it and was convinced I wouldn't get it. I had no journalistic training at that point. I had no film training. I had no experience. I hadn't even worked on the university paper. Like, I hadn't done anything that way since school. But the good thing was that I read Empire every day. I read the website every day, the magazine every month. So I knew the tone, I knew the style, I knew kind of what they did. So I think my sample stories were good, and that's what got my foot in the door.
So had you, sorry, just while I think, because I keep forgetting to do this, if anyone has any questions, just pop them in the Q&A box and we will share them. So had you been writing, for yourself, or writing on film?
Not really. I've been making an effort to educate myself on film, like kind of consciously, over the past, I don't know, however many years, probably since I was 13, 14, I'd been reading Empire, and I'd been sort of looking at those, 100 best lists and things like that, and thinking, I must try and see those. So I had been kind of going through phases of like, let's watch some 40s movies, let's watch Citizen Kane, and kind of going through the video stores literally in those days and doing that. But I hadn't been writing much. I'd written a couple of things for Ain't It Cool News, which used to take essentially anybody's contribution, so I could kind of do that. So I'd written a couple of things for those, but like that didn't impress anybody. That wasn't really proper writing. But as I say, I think, you know, legal writing for me anyway is quite a similar skill in some ways. You're making an argument. I mean, that's all a review is. It's an argument that this film is good or bad or indifferent, and I'll tell you why. And it's essentially like, you know, my client is guilty or innocent, and I'll tell you why. You know, it's not a wildly different mentality. You're trying to assemble evidence to make your case. So that was kind of my thinking. Yeah.
Sure. And was it a steep learning curve then when you arrived in Empire?
It was, yeah. I still had some bad writing habits. I still sometimes mixed up its and its. Like that really did take me until I was 23, 24 to get the hang of. I mixed up hoard and hoard, which comes up more than you would expect on a film magazine. So hoard with an OARD and an ORDE. So if those of you who play fantasy games, you probably know that instantly, but it took me a minute. And I read fantasy books, but maybe that was why I got them mixed up. And so things like that I had to learn. Elements of news writing I was pretty good on, but I wasn't 100%, obviously. And what I spent a lot of time doing in those early kind of months was editing other people's, transcribing and editing other people's interviews and getting them into a fit kind of state to be put up online. So I'd be given like a, I don't know, 3,000 word transcript of an interview with, I remember doing all the Lord of the Rings cast. That was coming out just as I started the final one. So I'd be trying to get these 3,000 word interviews down to 1,000 words and have it make sense and be coherent. So you'd be taking out the ums and the ahs, but also trying to kind of boil down what they said without, you know, flattening it so much that it ceases to sound like them, you know. So that was really, really, really good training. And also just listening to those interviews and transcribing those interviews was good training to learn what the heck you ask people, basically.
Sure. And I guess finding the thread of an argument in a piece that, you know, whether it be an interview or yeah, and trying to make it read coherently even once you've cut it back, because, you know, you actually may be moving questions around, so they may have been asked in a completely different order, and then you're trying to chop it up and just so that the copy flows in a way that, you know, because conversations kind of jump about sometimes, and that doesn't always work on the page, so sometimes you have to kind of chop and change. Yeah, absolutely. And so was it quite soon, or did it take some time before you were given the opportunity to review films yourself?
I think reviews came after a few months. So just to tell you how long it took me to kind of really get established. So that was a 3-month internship that I originally applied for. They asked me to stay for another 3. Then they asked me to stay for another 4, because after that point, they were having this new scheme where somebody would come in for 6 months and they would be in the office 4 days a week and train 1 day a week. So they asked me to stay until this person was going to start. And then when they started interviewing people for that job, they didn't like any of them as much as me. So they were like, well, would you like to apply for this 6-month thing? So I did that. So I was getting actual training finally after nearly a year. And then 6 months after that was probation. So I was basically there for 22 months before I had a proper job. And I think I was probably 5 or 6 months in before they gave me any kind of review. And I'm pretty sure my first one, I mean, I could probably look up when it actually was, but I think it was the DVD of Troy. I think that was one of my first ones. Or maybe that was the first one that was over 130 words. Actually, it might have been, that was a slightly big, it was like 200 words, you know, so that was the big time. Yeah, but in those, I mean, you do not go in and get given the big films to review immediately. And in fact, you get the films that nobody else wants to go and see. So I saw some of the worst films of my life in those early months. I saw a thing called Yu-Gi-Oh! Pyramid of Light. I mean, if you missed it, I wouldn't seek it out. It was just like, it's obviously a spin-off from the Yu-Gi-Oh! Cartoons. But I just remember a line in the opening is, even eternity doesn't last forever. And I'll be honest, it kind of lost me at that point. So apologies if any of your students are big Yu-Gi-Oh! Fans, but I was not on board. And I saw Soul Plane, which was an urban remake of Airplane, which is one of the funniest films ever made, and it was appalling. It was literally offensive to everyone. like every ethnicity, every religion I can think of. It was just awful. I hated it so much. So yeah, that was another one of my early ones. Yeah, it was, you don't get the good stuff to begin with. Let me just say.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, you will come back to this, but you do raise the point in your book about, you know, the gendering of what is the good stuff, and, you know, and what is the high stuff. And I mean, just this is a really basic question in some respects, but kind of no matter what industry you go into, you will end up going into an organization in a junior position and trying to impress people and make them want you to stay on.
Yeah.
I mean, how did you go about sort of
doing that?
Yeah, doing that.
Yeah, it's a really difficult thing, and we've actually even talked about this sometimes in the Empire office. We don't so much have work experience people anymore because it's now a physically small office that doesn't have a spare desk. So they don't always have somebody in now. But we used to talk about the fact that it is a really fine line to walk because we're all such weirdos for a start. And so you do get people who have kind of just strong opinions about everything, first of all, which can be difficult for a kind of young person coming in. But you do have to walk a fine line between being helpful and being all up in everybody's face all the time, you know, being available and being annoying, between not being afraid to ask for advice and help that you need. And also, again, not asking for advice on every single thing that's happening and having some kind of independence, you know. So that's quite a difficult balance, I think, for a lot of young people to hit. I think you have to be realistic as well. You're not going to go in and write the big review. You're not going to get sent to interview Tom Cruise in your first probably year or 2 or 3 or 4. You're going to work your way up to that. And you're going to have to kind of earn that trust. And you are going to get sent, in our case, it would have been, I started off mostly doing roundtable interviews, which we don't do so much anymore. But at that point, it would be these, you know, you'd have 5 or 6 people interviewing a celebrity at once. So there's kind of a limit to how much damage you can do.
You get 1 or 2 questions, presumably.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's other people there to ask. Having said that, never go into a roundtable underprepared if you are a journalist, because I have been in situations where there were four journalists in the room. 2 of them did not open their mouths at all, and one guy asked 1 question, and it was a person who was lovely but just giving sort of 1-sentence answers to everything, and we were in there for 25 minutes. And so after 20, when I had 100% carried the interview on my shoulders, I basically turned to the others and gave them a bit of a death stare and went, well, I see I've been monopolizing your time. One of my colleagues probably has a question. And stared at them until somebody, you know, was shamed into asking something. Yeah. But anyway, so my point being, you don't tend to get one-on-one sit down, you know, hangouts with Tom Cruise on his private jet kind of things. Not that I've still had that. That's just for the record. Is it? So it was literally like, be willing to make coffee, be willing to transcribe. I once transcribed some interviews from King Arthur set visit, the one with Clive Owen. And I was transcribing like the costume designer and the, you know, props master and people like that. And genuinely, I transcribed 37,000 words and not one of them was in the feature.
Wow.
So that was annoying, but I learned about props. So, you know.
Yeah, of course.
Yay.
I'm sure that knowledge has stood to you.
Right here. Yeah.
Apologies, by the way, all the construction has reopened this week in Ireland, so all my neighbours are putting in patios, so it's a lot of noise in the background.
Don't worry, I can't hear a thing. You may hear traffic noise outside. I'm by a mini roundabout, so every police car or ambulance that passes turns on their siren just to go around it. So apologies in advance.
Not at all. Just actually to pick up on something you said there, you talked about, you know, the office being physically smaller, etc. Yeah. Have work practices changed a lot, you know, because obviously in media and journalism more generally, you know, the way people work has changed dramatically.
Yeah, a lot. I mean, there's fewer people in the office now. There are, in terms of writers, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in the office, and there were probably twice that many when I started, you know. I'm not saying the sort of the stereotype of the journalist taking the long boozy lunch was probably already over by the time I started, but it wasn't unthinkable.
Sure.
And it's still not unthinkable. It still happens. The difference is, like, people are doing 6 different jobs now. You know, Empire, when I started, was 12 issues a year. It's now 13, plus they occasionally do Pilot magazine as well. Plus we do about 80 podcasts a year, you know, plus we'll do events, plus we'll do TV. So there's a lot more happening with a lot fewer people. So people are under a lot more pressure. And one of the nice things, actually, when we started doing the podcast, which was in 2012, it came at a time when we had been incredibly stressed out in the office. We'd been working just in little silos on our own little things, and kind of not talking to each other, but not having a lot of time to just talk nonsense to each other, which used to be a feature very much in the earlier days. And the podcast kind of gave us that back a little bit, and just gave us the kind of reminded us that we liked each other, and reminded us that we actually did have a good time together, which was good. So yeah.
You do seem to be having a lot of fun on the podcast.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's nonsense. That's why people complain about us being giggling idiots, because like we essentially are, you know.
There's a couple of questions just come in about like just that tips for starting out, and if you want to write on film, on you know, what people should be doing or could be doing now at this point, you know, in terms of sort of developing those skills.
Yeah. Okay, so my big piece of advice here is that it is good to practice writing to a word count. And I would set yourself a really limited word count. So the smaller reviews in Empire, the ones that are about that big, are 130 words, roughly. If you can write a good review in that space, then you are a good film writer, in my experience. So this is something that it probably took me the good couple of years to really kind of get good at that. I think reviewing is a particularly difficult skill. Admittedly, news writing might be a particularly difficult skill, but certainly when I was starting out at Empire, if you're right, I don't know if you can go back. I don't think you can even go back through our archive anymore. But the news stories in that era did not obey any normal journalistic rules of news stories. We would start with a digression about, I don't know, Yoda, the movie news Jedi Master, who had brought us some news today because it was a slow day. And we just have this ridiculous jokes because there was nothing happening. And so we'd try and spice it up. One of my colleagues wrote a piece entirely in Morse code at one point, I think. You know, I wrote a piece in the style of Jane Austen when they were making a new Pride and Prejudice. I mean, we do stupid stuff. So what I'm saying is there may be rules about news writing as well, but those didn't affect me as much. What did affect me was reviews, and trying to boil down a review into 130 words. So you have to explain what the film is, what you're talking about. You have to explain what you thought of it and justify that. And you have to somehow be entertaining in some fashion, because a review should have its own reason to read it, even if you never end up seeing the film. And trying to do all three of those in 130 words is genuinely difficult. And by the way, if it's a film with a long title, you're going to have less than 130 words because that'll take up an extra line. So you could be down to 75 or 80.
130 words is how many sentences?
I don't know, 5, 6?
Yeah.
Probably, yeah.
And so you are you leading with the punchy opinion, or do you start with a little plot outline? Can you not be that formulaic?
You can't even be that formulaic. It kind of depends. Some films you have to kind of lead with the plot to explain what your opinion is. So it's a bit like, once you get past that. I mean, one of my favorite all-time reviews is Anthony Lane on Speed, which I think is just one of the funniest things I've ever read. So he's in the New Yorker, obviously. It's all like snooty, intellectual. And he starts with this paragraph, which, and I'm paraphrasing horribly, but it's basically, Speed takes place in Los Angeles. It is set mostly aboard a bus. It is morally inert. It addresses no social issues. Its characters are stock. It's the film of the year. And like that to me is great. It tells you what the film is. It tells you what he thought of it, and it hooks you in to want to read more because you're so surprised by that conclusion. So that's always my kind of go-to example, not because you should, literally copy that, but just because it does all three things, I think, so well.
Absolutely. Anthony Lane also wrote one of my favorite reviews. He reviewed one of the Fast and Furious films in rhyming couplets. It's fantastic.
Yeah. He also described The Mummy from the 1999 Mummy as what would be left at the bottom of the pot if you made a nourishing winter soup out of white beans and the Terminator. And it's such a perfect description. I can't even deal with it. It's amazing.
That's fantastic. That does actually bring on. There's a question that's come in. It was something I also was wondering about. Well, films that maybe inspired your love of film, but also writing on film. I mean, for me, in college, 2 books that were big for me. One was Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, and one was Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, Pauline Kael's collection of writing. Were there writing on film that you found particularly inspiring?
Not that tended to come later. That came. It probably came when I was in uni and I started getting seriously into films, but not long before starting at Empire. And certainly like the Anthony Lane stuff, my dad got me Nobody's Perfect after starting at Empire. I'm just looking over at the reviews shelf at the moment. I have one of the first ones I read was Which Lie Did I Tell, the William Goldman book. And that's actually the sequel. The first one is Adventures in the Screen Trade, which I got later, but they're both fantastic. I love him. I've got Bambi versus Godzilla, the David Mamet as well, which I love. And yes, the usual suspects, the Pauline Kaels and so on. But yeah, I did get into it through Empire. Like I was an Empire reader from way back, and that probably shaped my opinions most.
Yeah. Actually, this is a total aside because I started reading Empire when I was, I don't know, 16.
Yeah, probably same.
At some point, this is a ridiculous question, maybe. But
no, bring it.
It's probably been answered, but the months started slipping out of sequence with the actual month where the magazine was reviewed. Can you explain that to me?
Right. So they always, if a magazine goes on sale at the end of February and it covers the month of March, it'll have April written on it so that you will pick it up in March still thinking it's in date, essentially. So it's to encourage you, even if it's the 30th of March, to think, oh, this is current, and pick it up. All magazines do that. That's totally normal.
Right.
In terms of the films that Empire covered, this is a little bit inside baseball, but there was a point where Total Film started trying to beat Empire to front covers. So let's say Transformers 16 is coming up. Total Film wanted to put it on the cover before Empire. So they'd go like 3 or 4 months maybe in advance of the film coming out. And then Empire kind of started fighting back essentially and started trying to go in front of Total Film. And I think pointed out to some of the studios, like we're at least, and I don't know the current figures, but we're at least twice their size historically, and sometimes 3 or 4 times their size. If they go before us, we don't put you on the cover. So then that slightly settled down again. I know that, I mean, our current editor, Terry White, who I think is just phenomenal. She's so phenomenally gifted. And if you haven't read her book, Coming Undone, it's heartbreaking and amazing. But she is very keen on not doing that. And she is very keen on the fact that magazines should be current. You should be able to rip the cover off a magazine and still be able to tell what month it was published in and what year, because it should be about what's happening right now. Because otherwise, kind of what's the point? Yeah. So we do tend to be a bit more timely than we used to be. But yeah, there was a weird arms race there for a couple of years, which actually ended when the Total Film editor responsible, who was a former Empire person, came back to Empire. Anyway, long story.
No, thank you. Apologies. That was just I've been thinking about that for 25 years, so it's good to get that said. Actually, but speaking about that timeliness, and this connects to a question that someone's asked here. I mean, obviously the fact that you have the podcast and the magazines, they would have a different relationship to timeliness, as it were. And someone's asked about do you prepare differently for reviewing, for the material on the podcast than for what you're writing in the magazine?
God bless you for thinking we prepare for the podcast. God bless you. No, I mean, I personally, genuinely for the podcast, think we should be as kind of off the cuff as possible. So I will certainly do some research and try and find a fact for that benighted 3-fact structure we're currently doing, but I won't like rehearse it, as is probably very evident when you listen to it. In terms of reviews, we will have seen the films. We won't necessarily have prepared any remarks. Some people do a little bit more. I think Ben has, goes in with a page of notes. But certainly myself, Chris, and I think James just wing it. For reviewing in the magazine, it depends. If it's a film that I feel essentially quite ambiguous about, or ambivalent maybe, I will maybe put in a bit more preparation. If it's a film that I know I have to review in a very short space of time, and it's a review that is a big one, I will take notes during the screening. Otherwise, I never do. But I did, for example, Force Awakens and the last two Avengers movies, I had to write in a matter of hours after seeing them. So I did take extensive notes of those. Because I knew I was literally, I had, I think, 30 minutes to write both Avengers reviews to get them up in time for the embargo. And so, that was about 800 words.
And typically you wouldn't take notes whilst watching a film?
No, not usually. I just try and watch it. Now, sometimes do I have cause to regret this when I wish I could quote something in the interview, in the review? Yes, I do. But I feel like it's better to personally just respond to the film more generally and more like a viewer, and less like an academic assignment. No disrespect to academics.
No, none taken. Can I ask you, did that change over time? Because that strikes me as something that maybe, when you start reviewing, you would naturally be more anxious about not missing something or capturing a response.
Maybe. I've probably brought notebooks more often in the first few years. But even then, I'd sometimes forget. And even then, I sometimes wouldn't actually write anything down. So it's developed a little bit, but probably not that much, actually. And again, when I say I started reviewing with things like Troy on DVD, I was reviewing DVDs and stuff at first, so there wasn't the same,
sure.
You could pause and make a note if you needed to.
And when you're sitting down to write about something you've watched, then are you just sort of looking for a gut reaction, trying to capture that? And is it like you know, obviously, because when we watch a film, we respond to it in some way. I often find that when I know I have to talk about the film in some way, it does affect my response, because while I'm watching it, I'm trying to think, well, why is this good or why is this bad? So is it that you have a response and then you go back and try and reverse engineer and understand where essentially
it is a bit of reverse engineering, and you're sometimes, there is a sort of mental checklist of acting, writing, directing, editing, costume, even cinematography, things like that. There is a kind of mental checklist, and you're going, well, was it the acting that made me think this wasn't good? Was it the directing? And there is a bit of reverse engineering, but I do find it quite difficult to explain, because I think it's just like case by case. Some films I will be more maybe analytical, certainly like comic booky things or book adaptations. I'll be talking about why they made certain choices to change or to maintain stuff that's in the source material. I might be thinking about it that way. If it's something a bit more, I don't know, Jim Jarmusch or Terrence Malick and less kind of plot driven, then obviously you're coming at it from a different angle. You're coming at it more from a sense of how it made you feel and why it made you feel that way and what is it that worked or didn't work about it. But I don't know is the unhelpful answer.
No, it's not. It's a really helpful answer, because, I think it's a really encouraging answer in some way, isn't it? In that, you watch it and you respond to it, and it's about, the first thing I say to every student in the first year is, you are all experts in cinema. Every single one of you is an expert in film. All we're trying to teach you here is how to articulate what you already know.
That's it.
So by trusting that instinct, that response.
Well, that's it, because the thing is as well, and I think that's a really, really good thing to teach, because that's one of the things I talked about in the book, is there has been this idea that there is a good film and a bad film, and what shapes what a good and important film is has kind of been shaped by, white straight male critics, and therefore films dealing with war, with politics, with man stuff, great men of history, have been treated as being more important, inherently more weighty, inherently more dramatic than things about women, about minorities, about whoever else. And you know, that has led people to feel alienated from kind of film culture. If, you know, the 500 greatest films ever made list only contains films by straight white men, and I'm pretty sure some of them are very close to doing just that. You know, that's incredibly alienating from people who don't belong to that tradition. So yeah, it is really important to say, like, everybody has their own opinion, and that opinion is valid, as long as you don't like Joker, which is terrible and I hate it.
Thank you. I wholeheartedly agree. That does, though, it does beg the question. I mean, what you said there about how we are, you know, that if you love cinema, you have been brought up within this tradition that venerates certain kinds of films. So does that mean that perhaps you also need to kind of be reflective on your own response as well? That, you know, because you make the point in the book that, you know, the way that women write about film critics write about films, you know, there is perhaps a pressure to kind of, you know, think about their responses in a way that male film critics don't have.
Yeah, so I think, like, so I am one of the people who's been able to make a career in the industry as it is, right? And someone like Pauline Kael, not that I'm comparing myself to her in terms of quality, but someone like her also had, you know, very strong opinions and was very open to male-made films, male stories, incredibly macho films a lot of the time in terms of what she loved. And I'm kind of the same. Like, I absolutely adore, you know, Alien, Predator, Terminator, all of these kind of male franchises. I love all the superheroes and all the rest. But we're the ones who've been able to make it. And I wonder if there are a lot of women out there who, you know, are absolutely as passionate about film as me, but are more into rom-coms. Well, I love rom-coms as well, actually, but are only into rom-coms and are not into all of these films, and therefore have been rejected by the hiring committees because that was seen as, you know, not important enough, not general enough. That's too niche an interest. And it's this idea that women's interests are niche and men's interests are the default setting, which is not the case. So yeah, it's all a chicken and egg thing historically about who, you know, which comes first.
Sure.
Male films being seen as important, or male films, you know, getting made for this at the same rate. Yeah. But yeah, it's complicated, but I do think that's beginning to change, and I think people are beginning to be more open to films made by other people, which is good. I
write a lot on the women's films in the 30s and 40s, the melodramas, and so I've read a lot of the reviews, the dailies, the industry reviews of films, and it's incredible when, like, they'll just say, oh, and you just see it over and over again, you know, this film is not particularly impressive, women will like it. That's this literally the stuff. And you know, all these reviews are obviously written by men.
Yeah.
And they just totally dismiss these films, but acknowledge that.
I mean, that's happening in the 90s and the noughties, you know, with a lot of rom-coms. Like, I will absolutely argue that Devil Wears Prada is the same film as Wall Street. And one of these films is a multi-Oscar winning, you know, thing that's considered a triumph of the 80s, and the other one is treated like a rom-com, even though it actually is not at all. So you know, you just get this weird dismissal of things that are about or for women, which has never seemed fair to me. So yeah, I think it is beginning to change though.
I mean, you in your book, you raise the this, is it famous or infamous claim made by Martin Scorsese that, you know, superhero films aren't cinema, and you make the fair point that you're not gonna weigh in on that, and I'm not gonna ask you to weigh in it, but I think the question is the more interesting question is what's at stake in asking that question as to what is cinema and what isn't cinema, you know. And so you talk about that idea of the gatekeepers and of, you know, those kind of old white men essentially defining what cinema is.
Yeah.
Do you think that's broadening out now? I mean, obviously what cinema is has changed because of technology, and even like what's in Empire now is very different to what was in Empire 25 years ago in terms of what's actually written about.
Yeah, that's true. I think the cinema question kind of gets me. I think he's wrong on Marvel. I think there is a purity at least in Kevin Feige, I'm not saying Disney are pure about it, but I think Kevin Feige has a genuine story to tell over this incredible, 23 films so far canvas. I think it's fascinating that that's happening, and I think there's no reason it can't be cinema. Anyway, however, I get what he's saying about content, and I think his more developed, not just the off the cuff remarks that were originally from Empire, but the more developed piece that he wrote about, was it Fellini, wasn't it? Recently, I actually agree with a lot of that. But the thing is, like, there's this idea that, if the superhero films all went away, that, Scorsese and his ilk would be able to do whatever they want. And that's not the case. That's not the world. It has always been a film business. They have always wanted to make 4 quadrant, if you want to call it, films that will sell around the world and that will make a huge amount of money, because it is show business. And there was that brief, weird moment in the 70s where the studios didn't know what the hell they were doing and allowed people like Scorsese to do something new. And it was fabulous, but it wasn't for everyone. It was just for white men. And it was brought down by their own hubris, because they tried to do too many things in a row that were incredibly expensive, incredibly dangerous, and or massive flops. So, like, I love him. I've never seen a bad Scorsese movie. I think he's great. But this idea that there is a fundamental great independent cinema that would exist if not for superheroes is, I think, completely wrong. If it wasn't superheroes, it would be more Transformers movies. And I, for one, will take Captain America any day over any of the Transformers sequels, although I do quite like the first one and Bumblebee. But anyway.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And I guess, I mean, a kind of related question that I'm interested in is, you also make the quote that in the book, you talk about it's hard to find a male film fan born around the 1980s who doesn't worship the ground that Scorsese walks on. And again, it's about this kind of defining the criteria of quality.
Yeah.
Are you very wary, or not wary isn't the word, aware when you're about the different audiences you're writing for as a film critic? So like if you're writing in the Daily Telegraph, the readership is quite different to.
Well, okay, that's weird. I don't read the Telegraph, by the way. I just got hired to write for them a number of times because I really, really rate their film editor. I think he's fabulous, and he's come to me with really good ideas and made stuff I've written for them better. But I still don't read the paper. But what's weird is there has been no pushback on anything I have ever said politically for them, and I have, just for badness, been quite feminist and been quite sort of outspoken in some of the stuff I've written for them, or quite woke, I suppose. So yeah, it's never come back to me. That has been fine. The only thing I ever got grief for that I wrote for them was a piece on the Snyder Cut, but that is a whole other bag of worms, and those people are awful. As far in my experience, absolutely awful. I have nothing against Zack Snyder himself, but his fans are the worst. So yeah, it's been weird. But yes, you're right. There's a at Empire, I can assume a level of film knowledge that I can't always. So I wrote for The Pool for a while that existed, and that was a kind of women's online magazine thing. And there I could not assume the same level of film knowledge. So I would have had to explain who Martin Scorsese was if I wrote about him in The Pool. Yeah. And there was a lot more kind of setting up of basic information I consider basic for that readership. So yeah, there's that kind of thing. But at the same time, we assumed they were educated women, so you wouldn't go nuts setting up who Martin Scorsese was. You'd just remind them that he did Goodfellas or whatever. So yeah.
In a way that I guess, you don't have to for Empire. You mentioned the Snyder fans, and you do talk about this again in the chapter in your book about, and I think you said you surveyed critics who had written on film, women critics on Twitter about responses they had got, and the level of abuse is not surprising but still very disturbing. I mean, have you had that experience yourself?
Yeah. I mean, it's been it's mostly just funny. Like, so I think I quoted this one in the book, but the guy who told me I couldn't understand Ghost Rider 2 because it wasn't for me. It's like, I mean, it's Ghost Rider 2, dude. I feel like I've got a handle on that. Thanks. But there is this assumption that it's our thing, we as men, own this thing and you have no right to an opinion on it. There is in some quarters, but you know, mostly it's been fine. Like I say, like, you know, if I was reviewing the last two the Avengers films, I loved them, so I wasn't going to get any grief for those. And I think also Marvel fans tend to be pretty upbeat because they're happy with the way things are going. DC fans less so. So I have had some grief for, as I say, Snyder Cut stuff and the Joker. For the Snyder Cut, can I just say, in my defense, they all say I you know, have disrespected Zack Snyder, which I haven't, and I, you know, hate the films, which I kind of do. But their particular beef with the Telegraph piece was that I said that the film was in such a state that it would take tens of millions of dollars to get it in a state in which it could be released. And well, that turned out to be the case. So I'm just saying, I was there like a year early. But yeah, they look, they're going to come at you. I mean, there are sometimes death threats and rape threats. I have reported those to Twitter or whatever. And they have generally, not always, but generally been acted on. I have become quicker with the block button in recent years. I used to argue them all into the ground, which I actually think is a pretty good tactic a lot of the time, because a lot of them do go away and never come back. But especially some of the diehard Snyder fans who were just lying about me. They were like, "Oh, you know, it's almost on the level, but not quite, of saying you're glad his daughter died," which I have never said anything like that, because that would be horrific. Sure. And some of them were claiming that kind of stuff. And I'm like, no, you're blocked, because I'm not going to just deal with factual untruths, you know, no point.
I mean, to talk a little bit about the book more generally, if we could, as I said, I really, really enjoyed it, and it's going to be on our reading lists next year.
Sorry, guys.
I mean, it's one of the things I really like about it is it offers this really accessible overview, and this is with my film professor hat on, to the history of film studies and ways of thinking about film that, you know, we would teach in the classroom, like everything from censorship to, you know, the auteur theory to Laura Mulvey and the male gaze and all those things, and so it explains those things in a really, really accessible way. But I think, you know, clearly one of the key concepts that you kind of wrestle with in the book is that of authorship.
Yeah.
Because it's, you know, it seems it's a concept that is, it's certainly not straightforward, is it? Because on the one hand, you know, one of the real problems is as you point out, that women are not given access to the keys to the castle, as it were, in the way that men are. But at the same time, I think you had a really nice quote, which I think I'm going to misquote it, but, you know, one of the biggest issues with the auteur theory is reality.
Yes.
You know, it doesn't actually capture how films are made, which is not by one person, but by a collective. And that idea of authorship is so bound up with this kind of idea of the tortured artist genius, which just, by the way, happens to excuse a whole lot of abusive behavior by those same tortured artist geniuses. So, you know, should we rehabilitate authorship? Should we abandon authorship? What do we do with this thing?
I find it really, I sort of fudged the ending of the chapter, really, because I'm a bit like both, maybe. So I feel like we should interrogate authorship a bit more. That's I think my basic takeaway. I feel like we shouldn't just talk so much about, oh my God, he's such a genius, you know, and give so much credit to a single, usually male director, at the expense of everyone around them, because, you know, it does flatten the work that women have always been allowed to do. I didn't really get into editors a lot in the book, but like film editors, there have been great film editors, and most of your favorite male filmmakers worked with female editors who were incredibly important in their career. Thelma Schoonmaker obviously being the most important, but like, you know, Steven Spielberg in his early days, Quentin Tarantino in his early days, all female editors. David Lean, for God's sake, you know. So it's not as simple as, oh, there's this great dude and he did everything on his own. Maybe in the case of Orson Welles, briefly, maybe, you know. But even then, like, we've got Mank and we've got Toll and everybody else. So yeah, I just feel like what it does is it puts a lot of power, a lot of authority, a lot of credit in the hands of a very small group of men. And it's a group that women historically have not been allowed to join. And that's the thing, like if it was 50-50, I might not feel quite so bad about the auteur, you know, brand, if you will. But but women haven't been allowed to do it. You know, people of color haven't been allowed to do it. Out gay people have sometimes been allowed to do it, but not as much. So it's problematic, you know.
Absolutely. I mean, it does, as you point out, have very kind of real practical effects. Like you point out, you know, when there are female producers, directors, there tends to be greater parity, gender parity in terms of the staffing of films more generally. And obviously that applies to people of color as well.
100%. So it's you know, if you have, I mean, look, this is partly because Hollywood is a very small town. There have been historic problems with unionization. You know, there was a massive resistance to opening up and making it more equal when in the late 70s, when they started looking at the craft unions, and they were basically handed down from father to son and nobody new was allowed in. So if you weren't white and your dad didn't work in, you know, camera department, forget about it. It just wasn't going to happen. So that kind of thing gradually began to change, but like we're still at the stage of gradually changing directors and kind of opening that up. But yeah, if you change those people at the top, it has a knock-on effect going all the way down. So, you know, if you by sort of implication, if you don't change that at the top, then you are going to end up with an unbalanced set overall. And you get these men who are just used to working with other men and don't see women as professional equals. And that has, you know, huge toxic effects all down the line.
Sure. And I mean, there's, you know, it's just the importance of lived experience as well, you know, and the diversity of that. I've told students in class this a couple of times, and it's, you know, it's a story that's kind of, it's something that I feel embarrassed about. But last year, my daughter, 2 years ago, she was 7, said to me, why do you always, when you watch sport, is it always men on television? And what struck me about it was, like, I can obviously intellectually recognize that fact and critique it, but she, as a 7-year-old, just instantly felt it. She just looked at it and said, that's not me. And so there is a limit to, you know, even the most sort of sensitive, empathetic male filmmakers. There's a limit to the extent to which they can, you know, give expression to female experience, basically.
100%. But and even, I just don't even think they notice the lack. I mean, and this is a bit, again, chicken and egg situation, but, you know, the fact that less than 30% of roles on screen, even in a crowd scene in Hollywood films, go to women. They've got maybe a quarter of the dialogue. I think it's a quarter of speaking roles historically. So, and it's because I think men just don't necessarily notice the disparity and they don't notice the lack. There is a perception, again, I've quoted this in the book, but there have been studies showing that men think that women dominate a conversation when they speak 30% of the time, and men think it's about equal when women are speaking 15% of the time. So, like, our perceptions are completely skewed. And I think that sets a limit on what a male director is going to allow his female cast and crew to kind of do. So, you know, we need to kind of, shift that up, basically. But yeah, there is a lived experience issue here. And I think also, and this is something I really emphasize in the last chapter, but it's cutting off the potential for so many stories. We keep getting all these straight white men who have daddy issues. And it's like, I feel like I've seen pretty much every twist on that. And every so often there'll be a great one. Like, I loved Ad Astra. I thought it was brilliant. But mostly it's just like pathetically boring storytelling. Whereas you get something like Get Out, which I haven't seen before, because it comes from a different background. It comes from someone who has different life experiences, a different culture. And so they're giving you a completely different hero for your film and a completely different world to explore. And that's kind of what we need, you know. And it's just, so it's leaving money on the table. It's not even if you don't believe, even if you think this is all woke nonsense and you don't believe in the moral case for equality and better representation, there is an entertainment case and a business case to be made for widening this, because it will make films feel original, even if they're, you know, the hoariest example of the genre ever, because it will be a different take.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you say, there's a lot of mediocre films out there by white men. It seems to me that maybe, and reading your book, that one of the markers of success is when we have a lot of mediocre films by women or people of color.
Yeah.
You know, like you don't just have these great auteurs that you can say, well, there's Catherine Bigelow, there's, you know, there's Agnes Varda, you know, that, but there's, I don't want to mention any male equivalents, but you know, you can think of plenty.
But there are, yeah.
You don't go, oh, I can't wait to see the next film by. But yet,
Edward Zwick. Like, I mean, you know, he's a good filmmaker. He's fine, but you know, without looking it up, can you name a lot of his films?
Yeah.
But you know, he's had a career. He's had a steady career. Even someone like Catherine Bigelow, after K-19 kind of underperformed, she was in director jail. She couldn't get a film made for years and had to basically raise a tiny budget and go off and make Zero Dark 30, Hurt Locker herself to get kind of back in the saddle. So because she wasn't allowed to fail, and that's what we need. You're absolutely right.
Time lags that you mentioned between films that women directors have experienced are just, you know,
horrific.
I mean, so when I'm reading the book, and as someone who loves cinema and who loves Hollywood cinema, sometimes it's hard not to just be disgusted at the whole edifice. You know, at times it's a very depressing, anger-inducing story.
Yeah.
As you know, someone who loves film, sometimes is that love tested?
Oh yeah, there's a level of compartmentalization. I mean, you know, it's almost like we were saying. I don't remember if this was on camera or off, but like Splash. When we talked about Splash earlier, you know, you have this rose-tinted memory of it, and then you go back and watch it, and you're like, oh, that's problematic. Okay. And I feel like there's a lot of that in cinema. Like even in His Girl Friday, a film that I absolutely adore, there's a really uncomfortable racial subplot that is just alluded to, not massively developed, but you're a bit like, oh no, you know. So you have to be able, I think, to compartmentalize a little bit. So, you know, I can still think that Shakespeare in Love is a hilarious film, and think that Harvey Weinstein was a monster, and that his, you know, Oscar campaign for that film was probably resulted in some injustice, for example. You know, so you kind of have to. I don't love the whole separating the art from the artist thing, because I think there are some people who should probably just be thrown in the bin. But at the same time, there's a little bit of that again, because there's so many people involved in a film. Yeah. So, you know, it does feel a bit unjust to kind of throw the whole film or the whole studio or the whole, you know, history of an era into the bin just because of the bad stuff. But I think we should be aware of the bad stuff and the injustices as well.
Absolutely. I mean, it does beg the question as an audience member as to what our responsibilities are. You know, for myself, someone who's both a film fan and a sports fan, it's very hard not to feel complicit. You know, in all sorts of exploitations. One thing actually that I thought was really interesting, a point you made early on in the book, was you were talking about how early women filmmakers like Lois Weber, for example, you know, didn't have the language to express the you know, what the oppression essentially that was going on, or the discrimination. So would that give you cause for optimism that, you know, that the ways that we talk about things are changing?
100%. And that's one of the reasons I really wanted to put in the chapter about the male gaze. So it's not just Laura Mulvey and company, but also some of the slightly more modern and in many cases more jokey tests of representation on film. So things like the Makomori test, the Furiosa test, the Clit test. I'm just going to let you look that one up yourselves, guys. The Jenny Gold test. You know, all of these things are about representation on screen, and none of them are, most of them aren't academic in the slightest, to be perfectly honest, but they just give you a moment's pause to think about it and think about what you're watching and what you're seeing and how balanced or not balanced it is. And it is actually quite helpful just to kind of sometimes just win arguments and explain to male friends who have not noticed that, you know, that cool girl in the action movie is a Smurfette, that there is only her and then there are all men, and isn't that a bit odd, you know? So again, it's just to have the conversation. I'm not saying we never watch, you know, Avengers or something again because there's only one main female character in it. If we gave up on every film that failed Bechdel, we'd give up on, I think, 60% of Hollywood movies, and many of them great ones, and many of them with really great female characters. But it's worth having the discussion because it does matter.
Absolutely. We're coming up to time. I don't want to keep you too long. There's a couple of questions I've finished with all of these with, which I want to get. Just a couple of quick fire before we do. A couple of quick fire questions that came in. Is there? Maybe I don't know if there's an answer to this, but what type of films are the easiest or hardest to review?
Ones you feel strongly about. If you love it or hate it, super easy to write the review. If you are kind of a 3-star-ish, so hard. So hard. So I was like, I mentioned writing both Avengers reviews in half an hour. That was possible because I love them so much. And yeah, I was giving them both 5 stars and I felt very strongly and I was able to quite quick. But yeah.
So when you're, the middle ground is hard to teach.
Middle ground. Oh yeah. Horrific.
Someone asking here, someone who currently writes film reviews on the college student site.
Oh, cool.
How would one perhaps go about turning that into a career? So what is the path into? Yeah,
this is a tough one because I mean the internship I got doesn't exist anymore, at least currently. The good news is there are some opportunities that weren't around. So Terry at Empire does, look out for new writers. And I know Simon Brew at Film Stories magazine has a commitment to publish, I think, 3 or 4 new writers every single issue. So that's kind of a way to get noticed. I think the website, is it Hey You Guys? Publishes people who are previously unseen, but doesn't pay. So I would not necessarily recommend that, to be perfectly honest. The big thing I would say that I know is helpful is this. If you are going to apply to places for professional film writing work or any kind of professional writing work, first of all, make sure your writing is spot on. And I'm talking punctuation, grammar, as well as spelling, but make sure they're all on point. If you have any questions about grammar, I read the book Eats, Shoots and Leaves just before starting at Empire, and I find it incredibly helpful in helping me nail down exactly when a semicolon is right and when a colon is right. Super, super good book. But yeah, get your spelling, grammar, and punctuation on point. If you are dyslexic, allowances will be made. Please do make that clear in your application. But as a general rule, unless you have something like a recognized dyslexia, and if you want to be a professional journalist, you have to have that stuff nailed down because no publications anymore have enough staff to rewrite you, basically. So you need to be good, first of all. That's all in your control. That's all good. The other thing I would say is if you're applying to places for work, write in the style of that place. So it can be a short sample. It can just be a reworking of one review that you rework for every different application you do. But it is better to do 10 tailored applications than 100 generic ones. So for example, at Empire, we don't ever say I think or any variation thereon in a review. So if we see that in a review that you sent us, we know you haven't tailored it to us. So don't do that. And then you have to be lucky. So you control how good you are. You control how much knowledge you have about the subject, how many films you've watched, how many practice reviews you've written, how much care and attention you put into your spelling and grammar and punctuation. Then there's the bit you don't control. And then you have to get lucky. And I can't help with that. So I can just wish you luck, basically. But do, find people's emails at publications. You can ask people for advice. A lot of people will actually give you it. And like I say, Film Stories and Terry at Empire will often take on new writers and are open to new writers. If you don't get a reply, it's okay to kind of maybe chase a week later or a couple of weeks later. I wouldn't chase multiple times. People forget stuff and that's okay. It happens. There was a really obnoxious article written by a guy recently who put in kind of read receipts on his emails. Like, I can't remember what it's called, but it's basically a way of knowing if somebody's looked at your email. And he was literally emailing people afterwards going, I see you open my email 3 times. Why haven't you replied? That will 100% get you blacklisted. You will never work again. Do not do that.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think all really, really great advice. So 2 very quick questions.
Sure, no worries.
One, and I don't know, is there an answer to this question? But can you describe a typical day in your job?
Not really anymore. So first of all, I'm freelance now. So yesterday I had 2 podcasts and then I sat and read a book, but it was a book for work. But that's all I did yesterday. Today I have been answering some emails this morning. I now have this. and I have a podcast later. Tomorrow there is nothing on my schedule, and I'm thinking about just going to the shops. So that's pretty great. But in normal life, the day is divided. Back when I was in the office, I would start the morning writing news stories or editing news stories on the site, or both. I would have a meeting with the other members of usually the online team, and we would come up with some features ideas. We would work on those. We might have interviews at a junket to go to. We might have a podcast to record, and usually we'd have a screening in the evening. Obviously, at the moment, all screenings are virtual, so that's just kind of as and when. I'll probably watch some this afternoon or this evening. Yeah, that's kind of it. So the weird thing is, of course, my days are not 9 to 5, so I'll watch films half the evening, which are actually for work. But you know, the good thing is that that's my work. Oh no, I have to watch a film this evening. Oh no, what a shame.
It's hard to convince people of that, I find. I can't.
Yeah.
I can't much with them. Finally, what qualities would you say someone needs to do your job?
You need to be willing to share your own opinion and stand up for it and explain it. And people may disagree, and that's fine, but it is the core of the job. You need a little bit of tact, and I think you need to be good at teamwork. I personally, and this is one of the reasons I have problems with the auteur theory, for example, but I personally think it really, really massively helps to be a nice person to deal with. I can tell you that about 3, at least, no more, of my first jobs going freelance were all because people happened to like me. So there was a guy we'd once had in for work experience who was now a commissioning editor at a website, who gave me my first piece of freelance work because I'd been nice to him when he was in for work experience. Another was a friend of a friend. Another person was Lauren Laverne, actually gave me work at the Pool, which when she owned it, because I had subbed in for Chris as her film critic when she was on radio. Well, it was still when she was at Six Music, but at a different time slot. So people just like, being nice is not just, you know, good karma, and it's not just morally right. It is also a really good career strategy and one worth cultivating. So just be good at getting along with people. Don't always shout everybody down, but do have your opinion, but don't be a dick about it, basically.
I think I can't think of a better way to finish the chat than that bit of advice. And thank you so much, Helen.
Such a pleasure. Really cheers.
I think there's so much helpful advice there for the students, and really interesting to talk about all your work and about the book, and which all my students will be reading next year.
I'm so sorry. Thanks, guys.
Thanks. If you want to just hang on 1 second, and
sure.
we'll just kick everyone out, and then we can say goodbye.
All right. Thanks all.